my life started after 40 as well. So for anyone who's in my situation, I want to encourage them that, obviously to follow their dream and do what they really want to do. And it's never too late. So I think 99% of the world still equates coffee to 1 spoon of coffee per person in a mug. An espresso bar or a coffee shop or a specialty coffee bar is focused around the artisan whose name, which is a barista.
Pleasure to have a very special guest, and I'm very, very happy that he's back with us. We had a chance to talk during In Your Own Words, and now we're on for a longer conversation. His name is Channa Galhenage. He's based in Paris. He has a very nice specialty coffee place called Café Loustic, and it's wonderful to have you on. Good morning. How are you?
Morning, Antoine. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So last time we spoke, you were mentioning that obviously you were affected by the COVID-19 and the lockdown in Paris. So you were mentioning that you were working on your e-shop to deliver coffee beans to your clients, and That's happens that you did it. Tell me more about that.
Yes, exactly. So this has been a project that has been sort of milling around my head for a long time. And one or two of my very good clients have recommended that I do it for years to sell beans and merchandise. And I was running around and I didn't prioritize it like a lot of very small business people. And during this lockdown, I finally had the time to do it. And it's actually not that easy to set up a web shop, because selling through Instagram, which is our primary source of information, if you like, most of our clients look at our Instagram rather than Facebook or website to see what we're up to. So of course the logical thing is to sell via Instagram, but it's not as easy as that, because you've got to set up payment platforms. Instagram belongs to Facebook, so you have to set it up, the shop on the Facebook platform, and then set up the shop on a separate website as well, and then link it all to Instagram. So it's actually like a labyrinth, and it takes ages. And sitting at home, I had to figure out how to do it myself. So it took about 4 weeks. It doesn't take that long. It just took me the time, in amongst all my other responsibilities, to do that. So I finally did that. I finally got there on last Saturday night at 9 p.m. And I was pleased so I set out, a little bit of information on Instagram to say that we had this e-shop. And so I received the first order at 10 p.m., the second order at 1 p.m. And the following day, I sold out. So I had 20 bags of coffee to sell, and within around 12 hours, they'd all sold out. So that was really nice. And so I spent Sunday at the cafe preparing those orders, and then Sunday and Monday delivering them.
So people were craving for your coffee, for your beans.
I think in general, people, and we've seen with my other roasters and my community, that of course people are running out of good coffee. Our clients are running out of good coffee. They don't want to buy supermarket coffee or anything else. So we've seen an exponential, increase in orders through all of our web shops. The roasters are already set up for that. They were recording incredible growth. But each cafe serves different coffee, and especially Loustic, because we have roasters that you don't find in France, because we don't use the local roasters that much, or Parisian. We don't use Parisian roasters, in fact. So, for example, we use my regular roaster is based in Antwerp in Belgium. It's Café Nation. But we had for what was supposed to be our birthday, a special roaster from called Morgon in Gothenburg in Sweden. And we also had a new roaster in Aix-en-Provence called Mana Espresso as well. So we didn't have our usual roaster. We had Morgon and Mana ordered for our birthday, which was supposed to be the 20th of March. But of course, we had to close on the 15th. So we couldn't we couldn't sell them, obviously face to face with customers coming in. So that's why I had to set up the e-shop to get rid of all these remaining bags.
Did you finally have your espresso that you longed so much for?
Not yet, because that's actually going to happen today, because I've got to go back to the cafe to set up in preparation for our partial reopening on the 11th. Because the thing is, it's not as easy as that, actually, because professional machines, if you use them, you have to clean them, meaning clean them with the product and the grinder as well. And that takes 15 to 20 minutes. So it's not really worth it for one espresso.
But that espresso probably is worth it.
It will be, but I think it will be worth the wait. Be worth the wait. But today I'm actually going in to clean the cafe, because obviously it's I've been there over the last week, but I have to give it a thorough clean and disinfect it, the surfaces now, and then again in a week's time. So I'm going to get a head start on that. Like, everything has to be cleaned from top to bottom again and disinfected with according to the new rules. And so I will be starting to prepare espressos now, and I've told some people who are in the neighborhood that there'll be free espresso today.
Yeah. So your story is very interesting, because like many people, you had a past life that had nothing to do with what you're doing right now. And somehow one day you got some enlightenment that probably what you were doing before is not exactly what you wanted. Can you tell us what you were doing before and why you decided to go into specialty coffee?
Yeah, of course, because it's also, I like to talk about this as well, because really my life started after 40 as well. So for anyone who's in my situation, I want to encourage them that, obviously to follow their dream and do what they really want to do. And it's never too late. I mean, we're all going to, theoretically now, I would have said this before before this virus, but we're all going to live to be a lot older than our parents, right? Most of us 80 to 100 maybe. And so, life is longer, and so we've got time. So I never really knew what I wanted to do after leaving school, university, and I just did a succession of odd jobs, but for the most part, for 20 or 15 years, I was working in recruitment and HR. And working in an office, it was all right. It was like a lot of people, it was to pay the rent. It was all right, but I wasn't happy. It wasn't my passion. It wasn't my dream. Around the time of, I think moving to France is important, because if you stay at home, well, for me in particular, I was sort of lazy in a certain way, not unmotivated to find an idea or business idea. I was just sort of drifting, on autopilot. When you immigrate to a country, obviously, as an immigrant, you join you're not first in the queue. You're sort of at the back of the queue. You have to move. You have to do something to be able to survive. And meaning even if you're applying for a job, it's harder than a local, for example. And so, but I had a job in recruitment around the time of the 2007-8 crisis. But of course, recruitment, HR, that's always at the front line of the economy. So right now, for example, so when things start to go pear-shaped, it's always those recruitment jobs that disappear first, because you can't recruit anybody, right? So at this time, in any case, at the same time, so there was this, plus at the same time, this, after 6 years of living in France, just being sick of drinking really bad coffee, having to hold your nose and drink coffee like that, this burnt, bitter potion that would have been better adapted to unblocked drains than satiate your craving for coffee. I sort of thought, well, why don't I just set up something? Why don't I get into good coffee and see how I can set up a project like that? Because that didn't exist really. That didn't exist really, except for one place that I discovered later in 2008-9. So it's a selfish project. I thought, I didn't do any market research. I didn't do a study, but Paris being an international city, and the specialty coffee movement was starting to take over in places like England and the rest of the world. really, and adapt to a newer profile. I thought, why don't I just set up a project for myself and see who follows? Do you know what I mean? And I knew that this project, and I still say that now, it's like an ethnic restaurant. And the coffee shops in France in 2020 are still largely like an ethnic restaurant for immigrants, like, for example, in France in the 1960s, 70s, for Tunisian, North African immigrants or African or Indo-Chinese immigrants. It's still like that. It brings together a community that knows what they want together, and then the locals who know what it is. So
but was the move complicated to go from a steady job to a passion of yours, which was coffee, obviously?
In actual fact, I ended up losing my job, being retrenched after the crisis. But luckily there was a lead time, so that was 2010. So round about, of course, when Lehman Brothers went down at the end of 2008, I still had a year and a half where I was still employed. Okay. So I had time and a salary to transition to.
Yeah, and the French system helps you with the indemnité and indemnité chômage afterwards for a period of time.
The French system is very good.
Okay.
With that, but I had time to train as barista.
Okay.
Get all the help that I needed and transition into coffee. So in actual fact, my story started when so I had this idea in my head. I was missing good coffee, but I opened a magazine that I read regularly, and just out of the blue, I saw this interesting article about the Rob Bergmans, who's the owner of Café Nation in Antwerp in Belgium. And for a while, I'm a traveler, and I hadn't been to Antwerp, and I'd heard so many good things about this city. So I read this article about him, and and there was just something about the way in this article that he was talking about coffee that just seemed so much fun, but also a really strict emphasis on quality at the same time, but not nerdy or geeky. So I thought, I've got to meet this guy. And I've always wanted to go to Antwerp. So I think a few days later, I took a train up to go and see him. He didn't know who I was, but I wanted to see his cafe and have good coffee. And it was the first good coffee I'd had, in a long time, really. And but at the weekend, so I met his staff, but he wasn't there. He was on a business trip when I went up there. And I didn't contact him or anything. I just went spontaneously to see him. And but I just talked to everyone. They were friendly, and I left my details. And 2 days later, he called me, right? And they said, I'd heard you've been looking for me. And I said, yeah. He says, well, I love Paris. I'm going to come down and see you. So we met in Paris, ironically, one street away where 4 years later I would set up my future cafe, not knowing that I would do that. And so from that, so he gave me a lot of help, not financial help, but a lot of advice, just really on everything. He was extremely generous, and he's my roaster to this day. And we forged a business partnership. And so the ball started rolling from there. And then when I lost my job, at the recruitment HR firm, I transitioned I'd done my barista training, and I actually started working for a newly opened specialty coffee place.
Can you explain to people in simple terms what is a specialty coffee? What is an espresso bar? And what's the main difference between the coffee that people are used to drink in cafes and stuff like that and a place like Café Loustic?
So a specialty coffee, an espresso bar or a coffee shop or a specialty coffee bar is focused around the artisan which is a barista. Now, it's important to distinguish this because we are trained. A barista is trained in coffee like a patisserie chef,
okay,
like a sommelier, like any artisan.
Who would have thought? Who would have thought that?
Exactly, because this is the thing about coffee, an image of coffee in particular, is that coffee is such a democratic, widespread product that people laugh when you say this. And it's funny because they think your grandma can make it, and your grandma can make it. Fine. But people just seem to, I think 99% of the world still equates coffee to 1 spoon of coffee per person in a mug.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, so, kind of simple, yes. You don't need to be trained for that.
And also, people just think that coffee has a coffee taste. One flavor. I think that's in a lot of people's minds. generally what it is.
Okay.
Right? Which is fair enough, because perhaps the coffee that they drink is like that. You see what I mean? If they buy instant coffee, or they buy, which I don't know the statistics, but I think it depends on what country you are. But I imagine that if you take the whole world, the coffee drinking world, the majority is easily instant coffee, or packets of ground coffee that you buy in a supermarket.
Yeah, which is why it's democratized, basically. Like most of these drinks, like tea and coffee, and you have the tea in the supermarkets, and then you have the Mariage Frères and those places, Palais d'été in Paris, which are specialty teas. But for coffee, it's less known, actually.
That's right. But I think in comparison to tea, the thing that distinguishes coffee is not the actual product, because in tea you have different types of tea. You have you have sencha, you have Ceylon, you have Darjeeling, you have a variety of teas. Okay, like wine, you have a variety of different wines. But coffee seems to be, in the supermarket, I think it seems to be distinguished by the type of roast it is, rather than the type of origin it is. I think, and that's in most people's minds who's buying it. So I think the consumer is still saying, well, I'm going to buy coffee and I prefer dark roast, or I prefer medium roast, or light roast. I think that's what's being chosen by the consumer who's buying in a supermarket. So to get back to what an espresso bar is, we are trained in coffee. We are trained. What does that mean? We are trained how to select, the product from roasters. We work with different suppliers who select. Generally, the specialty coffee is very good quality coffee grown at altitude. It's 100% Arabica, and it comes from the 15 best producing countries. The countries that produce the best quality, and there's something called Cup of Excellence as well. But generally speaking, if you take the 72 producing countries around the world, around 15 of them are chosen to suppliers, because there's a grading system as well, which I won't get into. It's a notation system, so it's part of a chain of events. And the barista is trained how to extract that coffee. Now, what does that mean? 70% of the deal is about having to regulate, if you like, a coffee grinder, to try and get the best flavor out of those beans, to put it quickly. And then we have recipes as well. It's when you see a barista in an espresso bar using a coffee machine, now we have to use formulas and scales. We weigh coffee as well. So it's like a recipe for baking a cake. Like, for example, a classic recipe may be 18 grams of ground coffee in a portafilter, the thing that you actually put into the machine that you see. And then you put a scale under, and with 18 grams, you might have 36 to 40 grams of liquid espresso coming out, and in a particular time. So, for example, 25 to 35 seconds. So it's exactly like baking a cake, right?
Okay.
You use 200 grams of, let's say, 500 grams of flour, eggs, water. You have specific quantities, temperature, baking temperature, and time. It's exactly the same in specialty coffee. Okay,
so basically it's artisan work, craftsman work for coffee. From the selection of the beans, from the terroir of the beans. I suppose the name terroir would also fit in the definition. Correct. The way it has been transformed and so roasted, and the final way, the way it is baked, cooked, the way it is roasted, and then afterwards the way it is actually prepared to serve the client for her enjoyment, basically.
Exactly. And of course, coffee is an organic product. So of course, there's not one type of coffee bean. There are many varieties of beans as well. When you extract coffee, it's, as I say, if you have the same type of bean that's been roasted from 1 week to the next, the extraction will change, because it won't be exactly the same. So the flavor will change. So in fact, every morning when we come in and what we call dial-in coffee, which means that you have to find the recipe, and it changes every day, because the recipe also changes according to not only grind but the temperature, the humidity in the cafe, and those factors as well, right?
Do people notice the difference? Would they notice really, or you really have to have the palate to know? You would probably know the difference and feel the difference because you've been trained. But would a client know the difference between, let's say, one day and the next, if the dial-in, for instance, is not done, or?
Yeah, if it's the same coffee. But we also a lot of espresso bars are quite often change their coffees every week or month as well.
Okay.
It's not always the same. So, for example, 1 week I'll have a Colombia, I'll have a Colombia Wheeler, and the next week I'll have a Panama, next week I'll have a Guatemala, for example. But these are the countries I'm talking about, but we may have the same country, but it doesn't work by country. It works by the farm as well. And in specialty coffee, about half the time we talk about, we buy coffee from either very specific farms, or if they're done in collectives like in Ethiopia, then a particular region. So, for example, the same type of bean will be grown by several different farmers, but put together in a collective. They'll push it together, and that will be sold as a collective, if you like. So, for example, it's very specific to region or farm.
So the notion of terroir would fit.
It's absolutely the definition, like in wine. It's exactly the same.
There is, as we're talking about origins, so your origin from Sri Lanka.
Yes.
And there's a very interesting story about Sri Lanka and coffee, actually. And I suppose that if you were going to reconnect with the Sri Lankan terroir for coffee, that would be something great to do. Tell us more about that.
I've actually been doing work in that regard, in actual fact. So I was born in Sri Lanka, but I left. I moved when I was a year old. We migrated to England. Up until 2016, I'd only been back about 5 times actually. So it's quite, it's a little bit foreign to me. I don't speak any of the Sri Lankan languages either. I just speak English and French. But so what the story I heard was that Sri Lanka was a coffee producing country, right? Up until around the 1860s, when something called coffee rust, which exists today in certain countries, unfortunately, it's a pest. It destroyed the coffee crop. So in the 19th century, Britain was the colonial power in Sri Lanka, like in India. So what they did was they just ripped out the coffee plants and replaced them with tea, which is why Sri Lanka, its main export now is very high quality tea, Ceylon tea. But so this disappeared. But what's been happening now is that with the specialty coffee movement, Sri Lankans are starting to explore plantations for growing high quality tea again, because high grown good quality Arabica grows at altitude. You need altitude. So from about, let's say, minimum 1,100 meters upwards, between 1,100 and 2,000. This is the general altitude it grows at, because of course you need the humidity, the altitude, those sorts of conditions, temperate conditions.
And the conditions are right,
they're absolutely perfect, right? Whereas Robusta, which is the coffee that's most served in the world, that doesn't have particular flavors. It's tough. It's got a coarse sort of bark-like taste, and it's full of caffeine, and that grows at low altitude, or countries like that. So in Sri Lanka,
yes.
So in Sri Lanka, of course, people are exploring this, but this is a movement that's been driven either by Sri Lankans who've emigrated to the West and who have come back, or who are leading that, or in Sri Lanka, there's an Australian guy who's been living there for 20 years who's been leading that movement as well. So that's slowly coming back. So I've been in discussion with these people, and I've even bought the coffee to actually. They don't export yet. I've taken some coffee back to France to actually serve, and it's been good as well. But we're at the start of this movement at the moment in Sri Lanka.
So it's very interesting to see that your story is a story of passion. It's a story of change. It's a story of adaptation. because being an expat to start with in France, first of all, you don't have that much of a network when you really start to work in France. Probably your initial work helped you to get that, but then you went off to a domain which probably didn't know many people. That change and that adaptation in Paris in particular, and for an expat, is it very complicated?
No, it's quite simple actually, because the domain, when you're working in the food domain, of course, when you're working in an artisanal domain, you find like-minded people, you find a community. So it's actually easier than you think. Also, you make contacts through through your training, for example, barista training, you meet all these things. But of course, in this particular context, food and beverage, of course, it's a big community. I mean, cafes are social places. So you find sociable people, in fact. So in actual fact, it's not that difficult to find help now, especially now in 2020. But it wasn't that difficult even 2009 when I started training, in fact.
And dealing with the French system?
Much easier than you think. That's a big myth. For me, it's been nothing but efficient, and that's one of the myths that I would like to, sort of dispel as well. Over the years, from the Sarkozy presidency, which he was a centre-right president, from 2007 onwards, they did a lot of things to simplify the administrative side of business. So for me personally, it's been very, very efficient, and there's been lots of help for business. And I think that's something that's misunderstood about the French system. Of course, there are other things that can come and bug you later, of course. But to be honest, comparing, there's this general perception that, which used to be true in France, because France, even though someone highlighted, they invented the word entrepreneur. It's a French word, right? The government hasn't supported entrepreneurs, right? It's been something that's done overseas, right? That's a dual irony, if you like. But it's got a lot better now with the support. And when you compare, the thing that you've got to understand is that the image is that France, difficult, socialist, doesn't help entrepreneurs, difficult to do business in, whereas United States or any other country, very easy to set up businesses and all that. But it's not, that's a kind of myth. In every country, it's difficult to run a business.
It's difficult to find clients.
Yeah, that part, the business side, is difficult in every single country, right? Developing your business. There is no exception to that because of the nature of the activity. It depends how much the government gets in your way, which I don't think is fiscally and all those sorts of things. I don't think it's that hard. There are one or two things that are more expensive, but then France is a different, it's a different society. We pay higher charges, but we get them back, as we're seeing now. As you say, in times of crisis now, during this, the management during this via the coronavirus has been, I think, pretty good actually by the French government, and it's been solid, and it's, you can see the return, right? With that, so there's a purpose to that, and I think we've had much better support in France than, for example, in the UK and certainly the US.
So basically, you when you decided to go into that passion of yours, you received the help from mentors. The environment allowed you also to develop your business in not such a complicated way. How difficult was it to convince the clients, to get the clients on board? Because at the end of the day, a business could be the best idea in the world. If you don't have clients,
Correct.
people enjoying your product, your service, then you don't have a business. How hard was it? And how difficult is it to grow the mass of people that would be interested or attracted by specialty coffee?
So because we're in a particular domain where we're a cafe, so it's actually easier to get clients than setting up a business where you have to cold call, for example, or market or use those domains. So this is a different thing, because people could just walk in and you don't have to bill anyone. It's money over the counter. But my particular context was that because I was in a quartier, so just a position, I'm geographically in the center of Paris, my cafe, but ironically, it's actually was and still is a bit of a no man's land. It's sort of like a Bermuda Triangle between four different areas. So Beaubourg, the Marais, the Haut-Marais, and Le Sentier. So it's this kind of Bermuda Triangle between all these established quartiers where, people didn't really go to. They worked there or they went through, but it's not. There aren't a lot of local Parisians there. But so first thing I did was my marketing was getting a fantastic designer in who's now become what we call a star architect, Dorothee Milikson, who does hotels. But she was very young. She was younger at the time, and so this is one of her early projects. And she did a marvelous job. She did a fantastic job. So because you've got to, as a cafe, you've got to pass what we call the blink test, meaning if people pass by, you've got to attract attention in a blink of an eye. So that was one thing, right?
And the name, and I guess the name also, Loustic.
The name, I suppose. But she has a lot of fans. My design had a lot of fans. So that was, there were a lot of curious graphic designers, interior designers who came in that first spell. So that's one thing. Another thing, because this is like, as I said, like an ethnic restaurant, it attracted a lot of interest from immigrants like myself, or expatriates, or tourists who was desperate for specialty coffee and couldn't find it. So we had that part as well. So that was, we attracted those people. The locals, on the other hand, they, of course, my cafe looks like, it's a nice place, but it looks like any other cafe. So you had these people coming in, but at the start, they weren't used to specialty coffee. Now, they were used to their horrible witches' potions that were, Robusta and extracted at 2 minutes, 30 the time to smoke a cigarette instead of 30 seconds. And they just weren't used to it, which is fine. So and just to be precise, specialty coffee, a lot of specialty coffee is quite, has slightly fruity overtones, slightly acidic, slightly can be, it's quite, has a tangy taste to it because the coffee, coffee comes from a bean, and the coffee bean is a fruit, right? So we don't and what generally tends to happen in France and other countries is that they just get a low quality bean and they just roast it to death. They just burn it. So it's a poor quality product and they burn it, right? It's like, it's like steak in England, the well done steak, for example. You just massacre it, right? It's a bit like that. So the coffee was like that. So they came in, a lot of clients, and they had this, tangy tasting potion, and they just hated it, right? They just hated it. A lot of, especially older people. So the black coffee, we had to deal with that and all that. But the younger French people who are more connected or done studies overseas, or they're more into milk coffee. And what attracts people, of course, is the latte art, the designs on the that you do on the, with the milk of the coffee to make, flowers or rosettas or, hearts and all that sort of stuff. And that attracted a younger sort of Instagram, more international public, because also France is particular as well, because there's a massive difference between generations. This younger generation is much more, speaks more than one language, is internet savvy, is better traveled, studied overseas, right? Compared to their parents who are...
Yes, and they're open to experiences.
Correct. And as I say, so we've had this trickle of younger people who've seen us on social media, or as I say, they've experienced specialty coffee because there's a lot of young French people who've studied in Erasmus in other countries, particularly in the UK, or they've done working holidays in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States. So they've experienced that, and they've come home and they know what it is, and they're looking for that.
Okay, so it's going to be a slow growth where you're going to get converts, basically, that's once they start basically tasting this kind of coffee, specialty coffee, they would feel and realize what the difference is. They would like it, and they will keep on basically drinking it. So it's something that is going to be gradual and take time and time over. Can it become a mass product?
In the French context, because it's not Anglo-Saxon, we had a lot of interest at the start, but to develop a clientele, but it is very difficult. So we haven't, and also there's certain contexts. So I think I think we've reached a plateau now. We haven't been growing in the last couple of years, for example, but there are other social changes in France, that have impacted on our business. But it's actually difficult once you reach a plateau to do, depending on what size you is, and if you don't. Our context is we don't have a kitchen as well. So that's, if you like, that's also another important thing as well. It's easier to develop if you have a kitchen, but then a kitchen with a coffee shop is a different concept as well. But I do admit it's hard to grow a business after you reach a certain plateau. But it's like a revolving door as well. You know, especially a city like Paris is turning into Brussels, where there are a lot of people here for a short time. Or they, in our particular neighborhood, French people move, after, especially in a big city, they may live there for a year or two, but they may move as well. So there's a state of flux as well, and I think that's also linked to the type of employment that's around at the moment.
How did you decide to call it Café Loustic? Because Loustic in French is le petit gars.
Yeah, exactly. It comes from Old Breton. It means, well, in English, it means like little smart aleck, or if you want to be more vulgar, it means little smart ass, right? So it normally refers to children, but it's actually, so what I wanted was, I like slang words.
Plenty of them in France.
Exactly. But because I'm not French, it was a bit more, I mean, I'm fluent in French, but, obviously this is something that slang comes from when you grow up in a country, you're more in tune to it, you're more plugged into it. And so I thought about it for a little while. I wanted something with an identity. And remember, this is the end of 2012 as well. At the time, a lot of businesses were it was a trend amongst French people to name their businesses with English words. Being, UK, I wasn't going to do that, right? Also, I like a local identity. I wanted something French, but slang as well. And also, non-negligible. It wasn't the motivation, but your business needs to be found easily on Google at the time. This is before Instagram, okay? And Facebook and all that. You need to do a Google search and find it, quickly, right? I mean, if you type in, for example, if I named it, let's say something stupid, Le Coffee Shop, right? If you type that into Google, you wouldn't find it, because coffee and shop would have just come up with a lot of searches. Maybe coffee shop Paris, and it's difficult. Whereas Loustic Cafe, you get there straight away.
Yeah, because there's not that many Loustic Cafe.
There's only one or two, right? There's one in Montreal as well, in Montreal, I think. But I've opened before then. So you have to keep that in mind in this modern context as well. So in actual fact, I couldn't find. I was thinking, oh God, where am I going to find a name like that? But then I remembered when I was a student, one of my favorite bands was a Parisian group called Les Négresses Vertes.
Oui.
Okay? Right, and they're one of my absolute favorite groups, and they are homegrown Parisians, but with a lot of roots, a lot of flavor, and of course, as you know, anyone who knows them, they sing in slang. Okay,
yes.
So light bulb moment. So what I did was I went online, and I mean I've got all their albums, but I went online and I went through all of their songs and all of their lyrics. Okay. And as one of my friends is a marketing expert, he says, if you're going to name a business, you have to come up with 100 names, and it doesn't matter how stupid they are, because it's a creative process, right? You don't have to think of good names. You can call it really just the most idiotic names, and after a while, after your 10th, 20th name, things start to come, right? So I started off with that, but then around about 25 names, I started to look at go through all the lyrics of the Les Négresses Vertes, and I noted down another, I think, 20 names or expressions or whatever. And I stumbled across, then I shortlisted them, and I came across Loustic, because also Loustic, in this particular song that they were was a barfly in a Parisian cafe. So I thought Loustic Cafe, great. And then I looked up the etymology of the word, and it's not even modern French. It's actually it's old Breton. It comes from the old Brittany language. It's not even modern Breton, Brittany. And Loustic as well, because I studied a bit of German as well.
Lustig
sounds like either Lustig or Lustig with a G. So of course, France being France having been settled by the Franks, who are a German tribe. Okay, that's where the name France comes from. The Franks, right? I thought, but the Britons were there already. I wonder if this word comes from German or Germanic, has a Germanic origin. Yes. I don't know, but given the meaning, because Loustic, or in modern argot, is like, as I say, for a little, It's normally referred to children, but it's like a little smart aleck, right? Or somebody little, petit malin, I want, and in German, meaning lustig means funny.
Funny, yes.
In that sense as well. I wonder if there's a connection there. But anyway, I settled upon this name, and that's how I got to this name.
So you name it Café Loustic, as they say, and the rest is history.
Correct.
So how do you see the future from now on?
Very good question. Of course, we're coming out of lockdown on the 11th of May, and I'm opening partially on the 11th for takeaway. But we're not allowed to, restaurants and cafes are not allowed for sit-in clients at all. Or we have to operate, one person at a time in the cafe for hygiene reasons and all these sorts of things. Excuse me. So the future is, if we're going to survive, is two things. We have to be local. I think that's going to come back to us. I think people in the neighborhood are going to come to us because we're local, because while we're still in lockdown or even after. And we've also got to deliver to people as well, because this virus isn't going to go away, for a while, until they find a vaccine, and even beyond that. So I think we've got 18 months worth. And let's not forget that if there are reinfections, if the mortality rate or the infection rate starts to go up after lockdown, we could be locked down again. We could be closed again. Okay. And maybe once or twice and all that. I mean, they're talking about that, especially in winter, where the rate of infection generally goes up. It's going to be a kind of a wave. It's going to be a roller coaster until they find a vaccine, right? So we have to think long term. Our survival depends on, I think, especially in the French context, takeaway coffee bags for people to prepare at home, and that proximity as well, being local and friendly, and knowing the name of your barista or baristas. Do you know what I mean? Which is
yes.
What happened. Because I think also after this, I think more people are going to be working from home. My area where Loustic is situated, the people who live around there, I don't have a lot of regular clients who live on the street or around, because it's quite expensive to live there. But the irony, it's expensive because it's the Marais and it's the center, but it's not glamorous, right? It looks a bit run down, but to live there, you have to be, the people who live there are people who do dream careers, in inverted commas. So they're architects, they're graphic designers, they're people who've succeeded in these, so maybe 30, 40, 50 age group. So it's not as young as the Canal Saint-Martin, which is much younger. Yes. Work in fashion. A lot of people work in fashion. We've got a few airline pilots who live in the area, and hostesses as well, airline hostesses as well. They are not there, right? But we don't see them. I mean, pilots are flying, hostesses are flying. Architects are always working on strange hours. The people who are clients, they travel, or they're working on big long projects that take 3 weeks. Do you see what I mean? So we don't see them. We see them from time to time. We know who they are, but they're not there every day. Do you know what I mean? They don't have time to hang out in coffee shops. So, but I think we're going to see more of them now.
Okay, so the sense of community is going to be increased. The togetherness will be increased.
I think so, but more people will work from home. Flights are grounded. Yeah, so we're going to see some of these people. I know one of my very, very good clients. He's a pilot for Air France, but there's no flights for him, so he's been put on cargo. He's flying cargo, which is of course running very, very well. But those schedules are different. So I've actually seen him more.
Yes.
I've actually had more communication with him via email, and I've seen him and I've delivered beans to him, right, in the last month than I have in the previous 7 years.
So basically, one of the advantage of this crisis, albeit the terrible human toll, is that it got people closer together.
Correct. I hope so. But there's also, let's not forget that there are the economic context as well. So the real answer to your question is I don't know, right? Because we're not out of the woods yet, and certainly I think we're in a kind of bubble because everyone's being paid their salaries. But the context in France as of today, the 2nd of May, is that there are 10.3 million people on partial unemployment, which is about 25% of the active population.
Huge.
This is depression
huge.
level. Okay, yeah. So once once things start rolling out again, people are at the moment being paid their salaries by the government, these 10 million people, but in the attempt to, so we've kept our employees, but their salaries are being kept by the government. But then afterwards, after economic activity recommences, that's all going to depend on, they're no longer going to be paid by the government, and we have to see whether we can keep them or not. Otherwise, we have to retrench people, and that's going to be the unfortunate reality that there is going to be some human cost, unfortunately, to that.
Yeah. So we will see what the future is going to hold for all of us in this period of crisis.
Exactly. So afterwards, of course, there's going to be a lowering of purchasing power for sure, and so we're going to have to adapt to that and see what's going to happen.
Hopefully, things will get sorted out. Yeah.
In the restaurant business, unfortunately, when the restaurants are allowed to open to welcome the public, of course, there's still going to be hygiene measures put in. We are not allowed to fill up our restaurants. It will be 50% maximum, right? Which, of course, is not profitable for us. So, unfortunately, you could see between 50 and 80% of restaurants disappear, which is very unfortunate just because, as I said, because of the restrictions that have been put in place. I hope that's not the case, but, we'll see. So these are our challenges.
Time will tell. To conclude the interview, I run this little questionnaire, which is the adaptation of the Pivot Questionnaire. So, as you've been living in France for a long time, you know Bernard Pivot.
Of course.
So he used this questionnaire based on the Proust questionnaire. And so there was a lot of changes afterwards, and James Lipton from inside the Actors Studio also did an adaptation of it. So I'm going to ask you some of these questions.
Okay.
And it's the first answer that comes to your mind. You ready?
Yes.
Okay. So what is your favorite word?
Coffee.
What is your least favorite word?
Stress.
What is your favorite virtue?
Kindness.
What is your favorite quality in a man?
Loyalty.
What is your favorite quality in a woman?
Loyalty.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
There are three different things.
Yes, choose whatever you want. Creatively, let's say.
Entrepreneurship.
Okay, what turns you off?
Disloyal people.
Okay, what is your favorite curse word?
In French or in English?
Whatever you want.
Oh, in French, I've got this. Well, I don't know. It's curse. I don't know. It's not a curse, but poof, yes, I think is my favorite.
Okay.
My favorite insult. Yeah, right.
Yes. What sound or noise?
That's my absolute favorite. Yeah.
Yes. What sound or noise do you love the most?
I'm sorry?
What sound or noise do you love the most?
Of music.
Okay. What sound or noise do you hate?
Car horns, for example.
Okay. What is your favorite drug?
Coffee, of course.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt? Would you like to do?
Setting up events management.
Okay. What profession would you not like to do?
All the others.
That's a lot of them. Okay. So if you believe in reincarnation, what plant or animal would you like to be reincarnated in?
Oh, animal, probably a horse or an elephant. If it's a plant, probably something like, it can be like a flycatcher.
Okay.
Carnivorous plant, maybe.
Okay, fair enough. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God tell you when you arrive at the pearly gates?
There's a coffee waiting for you on the bar, Channa.
Channa Galhenage, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
And all the best for the future.
Thank you. You
Goodbye.
too. Bye.